to this Green Party Live. Every other Monday, we've been gathering together Green friends, Green Party members and supporters to explore our policies one by one, and also look at how each policy connects to other policies to create a systems change that we're going to need if we're going to deliver the environmental, social and economic justice that we know we need for everyone. So with COP26 coming up very, very soon now, we've been exploring our policies in a way that connects us up to some of the ripples of change that are going to be needed to create a green wave locally, nationally, and globally. But before we start the policy discussion tonight, I'd just like to remind anyone watching that no policy is an island. All policies impact emissions, equality, and jobs, and none of our policies work on their own. They connect to create a web of things that can be changed, that devolves power to communities, enhances the lives and rights of all living things, and brings justice and equity to both people and planet. So before we jump into the conversation, just a little bit of housekeeping. There's going to be time for a Q&A, and please use the Q&A function and upvoting to make the questions easy to find and also to be a bit democratic in the selection process. So anything that goes in the chat will not be used for questions. So if you want a question to come up in the Q&A, make sure you use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. So I'm now going to ask our panelists this evening to introduce themselves. First of all, we've got two people from our Climate Emergency Policy Working Group. There's Tony Firkins and David Flint. So if you'd each like to briefly, with one sentence, just introduce yourself, who you are, why you're here.
Okay, I'm David Flint. I'm convener of the Policy Working Group, and I'm here because dealing with the climate emergency is the single most important thing anyone can work on.
Fantastic. Tony.
And I'm Tony Firkins. I'm from the Hounslow Green Party. I'm a member of the Climate Emergency Policy Working Group and have led up a lot of the work on the Energy Policy Working Group. And again, because climate emergency is so important, it seems to be a very important thing to spend my time on.
Great. We have a new Green councillor, or new to the Green Party Green councillor with us. Joanna Wright, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Good evening, everyone. I was a Green Party member. I was elected in 2019 as a Liberal Democrat here in Bath and North East Somerset, and I've recently gone back to the Green Party, and I'm very happy to be with the people I think understand the issues. I'm cabinet member for transport at Bath and North East Somerset, and I guess what I bring to you this evening is real life experience of the political role of trying to deliver transport change.
Fantastic, thank you. And then John Whiteleg, Professor John Whiteleg, I should say, would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, it's great to be able to take part in this remotely as always. I've been a member of the Green Party since 1999, former City Councillor, Lancaster City Council. My main interest has for a long time has been in the conjunction, the coincidence of social justice, climate change, public health, and a whole number of fiscal responsibility. Transport policy has the power to deliver on practically every single policy thing that we think is important. So your point about the web, Caroline, is accurate. And I'm just keen to make sure that we kind of get a better grip on how to push that into connectedness, co-benefits and so on. And that's what I think will come out of this discussion.
Fantastic. And finally, we have the convener of the Transport Policy Working Group, Alan Francis. Alan, would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Hi, Alan Francis. I'm from Milton Keynes, and as Caroline said, I'm the convener of the Transport Policy Working Group. I have previously been the transport speaker, and I've been the chair of GPEX, and I've been in the Green Party for about 40 years now, I think. Sometimes forget how long ago it was I joined. I joined initially, I was interested in environmental things, and I felt that campaign groups like Friends of the Earth had been a part of, weren't getting anywhere, and so we needed to tackle the other parties where we had more leverage, which meant standing in elections. I'm particularly involved with issues around public transport, buses, rail, and around cycling. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. So I'm going to get going with the initial part of this discussion, where I'm going to be asking a few questions. So, yes, so store up your questions, put them in the Q&A, remember not the chat for questions. So Tony, I'm going to come to you first, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the way that the transport sector produces a lot of emissions, and just how, what is the scale of those emissions, and which kinds of transport produce carbon emissions as well, in what sort of proportions? So can you talk us through that a bit?
Sure, Caroline. So I'm going to do a quick whistle-stop tour of the transport emissions and break them down a bit, just so we get a feeling of what the big things are and what the small things are, and then hopefully our discussion will address the bigger things. I'm using kind of numbers which are in terms of megatons of carbon dioxide. We, as the UK, emit about 500 of those a year, so remember that. And from transport, that I'm going to go through very quickly, we probably emit about 170, so about a third of our production emissions in the UK is from transport. The largest in most breakdowns is cars, which will be about 70 of that 170. Which will come from the tailpipes of cars burning petrol and diesel. And then to break it down slightly further, 70% of those would be from trips of over 10 miles and 40% over 20 miles. So there's some quite significant emissions from the longer trips. The aviation is a very strange one, because sometimes only domestic aviation is counted, but we need to count all the international aviation as well. This can be talked about as 40 megatons of CO2, which would be half of cars. But when you include high altitude aviation, and whether you should include inbound and outbound flights, it can easily come to higher than aviation. Then we go on to some really significant but smaller ones. The HGVs will be coming in at 20 megatons or so of CO2 per year. Vans also at 20. The shipping is another one where it's split into international and national, and so almost comes to about 20 megatons of CO2 a year, so still pretty significant. But some other ones which are quite a lot smaller are buses and coaches, really only 3 out of 170. Rail is only about 3 out of 170. I've been asked to look into road building recently, and I think that might be about 3 of these megatons of CO2. So kind of very much dwarfed by the usage of cars and usage of planes. But another big significant one we're not going to talk about today, because we talked about it in previous sessions, is the refining of the fuels that we use is also pretty significantly large. So I hope that's a whistle-stop tour of the emissions. You're on mute, Caroline.
I was just trying to avoid sharing some background noise with you. That's really helpful, Tony. And so basically, kind of cars are a massive contributor here. And that's something that I hope we're going to be able to talk about quite a bit this evening. So my next question is for David. And my question is, what do you think are the key policies to reduce these transport emissions from the perspective of the Climate Emergency Policy Working Group? And then I'm going to come to the transport people after.
Caroline, thank you. The transport emissions are, I was tempted to say, a big problem. In fact, it's a set of big problems. And so the policies that are required are numerous and somewhat complicated. But let me try and simplify it. Seems to me you can pick up the policies as 3 parts: reduce, transform, electrify. Reduce is obvious. We need fewer people to be traveling shorter distances and less stuff to be travel shorter distances. Transform means modal shift, moving people from cars to buses or trains, and encouraging people to do more of their traveling by walking and cycling. And of course, not to fly at all, ideally, but certainly to fly a great deal less. Modal shift. Down at the bottom, insofar as we have transport requirements, and obviously we will continue to have a lot of transport requirements, we should be doing it with electric traction where it isn't done by human muscle power. So that's the basic. But how do we make that happen? Because that's just what we want to achieve. How do we make it happen? Half a dozen things seem to me to be key. One's carbon tax. Carbon tax taxes the high emission activities, so particularly flying and car driving, but other things too. And that drives all the shifts we want. Not necessarily enough, not in fact enough, but it is certainly. Secondly, there are some specific things. Frequent flyer level to discourage frequent flying, obviously enough. Road pricing to give us more leverage on road travel. And then there are some planning things. Clearly, we need to be banning all airport expansion. And clearly we need to be not building more roads. Straightforward things, functions of planning, but actually planning in the sense of what central government does, largely outside the control of local government. Moving on from that, there are things we do need to spend on. That would be walking and cycling infrastructure, better bus services, de-dum. Well, I could carry on, but I won't. I'll stop. Back to you, Caroline.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. So basically reduce the amount of traveling going on in the first place, transform those journeys and make sure as many of those journeys are run by electricity rather than fossil fuels as far as possible. So that brings me to John Whiteleg. And John, looking at kind of local and national travel, many people live in places where they feel forced to use a car just to access work, shops, healthcare and education. So how can we reduce car use without leaving people unable to get around? So over to you.
Thank you. That's obviously very important. And I'm sitting here in Shrewsbury in darkest rural Tory-controlled Shropshire. Where we have a great deal of emphasis on building roads and free car parking and a whole number of other things in order to encourage people to drive, and budget and policy decisions which are aimed at cutting buses. The council 2 weeks ago refused to fund any walking and cycling initiatives and so on. So in terms of the bigger picture, there's a lot of bad news into bad decision making and encouraging the things we should not encourage to make things worse that we do not need to make worse. But there's a lot of good news. I've just returned to Shropshire from 11 months in Sweden. I lived in a very rural area. I had 26 buses every day from 6 a.m. in the morning till 11 p.m. at night, half that number on a weekend and holiday times. The good news is that we're drowning in best practice, and it's not even other countries. There are some excellent best practice examples, for example, in this country, Cornwall with its bus policy. So the basic approach that I've adopted, and we've recently completed a project in South Shropshire, and I think Holly's put the link up somewhere, the South Shropshire Climate Action, it's a kind of a citizens action, citizen jury project. We've gone through dozens of different policy options. We've calculated carbon dioxide emission reductions by modal shift to walking, cycling, public transport, car share, electric bicycles, e-cargo bikes. It goes on and on and on and on and on. And we've showed how it can be done, and how it's a lot less expensive than the things that we currently do badly. And we've shown by how much that reduces carbon dioxide emissions. So my approach is that, first of all, and the Green Party, as we all know, it's the only party that says this clearly, we have to actually boost and promote all these different things, which are often summarized in another framework called, a bit like David's framework, avoid, shift and improve. You know, we have to stop doing things that create unnecessary travel and unnecessary demands that support car-based transport. We have to maximize modal shift. And then the improved bit is things like electric vehicles, but it's other things as well. My German colleagues have produced masses of research showing that most of the gains from electric vehicles in terms of emission reduction are cancelled out by the increasing heavy weight of cars, SUVs and so on. So yeah, the problem is we know how to do it. We know how to generate the kind of choice mechanisms, behavioral change shift that will massively reduce this big car component that Tony talked about. And the problem is that we have to overcome a great deal of inbuilt opposition and inbuilt difficulties with pursuing those options. But I'm very keen indeed that we use a lot of best practice. We point out what can be done. We point out that it's good for public health, the co-benefits. It's good for fiscal responsibility. It's good for social justice. So we've got all the evidence, and all we have to do, I think, is perhaps a little bit more emphasis on co-benefits. They're demonstrating public health gains, fiscal responsibility gains, social justice gains, and so on. So please do look at the South Shropshire Climate Action Report, because just coincidentally, that's currently doing the rounds. Our MP for Ludlow, Philip Dunn, Conservative chair of the House of Commons Environmental Audit Committee, has waved it around in the House of Commons. Having spoken to me, he said he doesn't agree with everything, which I'm surprised he agrees with anything, but he's circulating it round the Commons and round whatever the Environmental Audit Committee does. So that report spells out all the detail that we need to do to decarbonise transport. And the government's recent decarbonising transport document, policy document, is rubbish, and it doesn't tell us how to do it.
Fantastic. And the link to the report that John was just talking about has been put in the chat, so you can all have a look at it. And I think, you know, the point you were making, John, about the co-benefits, you know, the increase in physical activity if people are using public transport, walking and cycling for their daily journeys, and actually enabling people to do that, because so many of our roads, particularly in rural areas and in the kind of public transport deserts in outer areas of suburbs of the bigger towns and cities, where people just feel forced to use a car, and the roads are so hostile and traffic dominated that it's actually pretty scary to decide to walk or make a journey by cycling. I'm going to move on to Joanna. Joanna, I wonder if you can give us a bit of the perspective of the experience of Green councillors implementing these kind of policies, or do it from the perspective of having been an executive member, even if it was for a different party, and what you think the main challenges are just in terms of actually getting these policies into practice.
I think lots of people need to understand the process of local government. So you have an officer corps who has invariably been in a position of power. When I say power, have been in a position of working with people of positions of power for many years, and invariably don't have the training or the background that a lot of people who would and believe in change have. So they've been involved in transport and policy around that for a long time, and they're conservative with a small c, and they don't particularly want to change. And they also see that the elected body comes and goes. So what they are going to put in place is difficult to enable and make happen. And that was clearly my experience, was that I was elected, and the first thing I tried to do was put in a livable neighbourhood policy. And I worked very hard with the officers to reimagine road space, to imagine speeds of cars and how fast they should be allowed to go, and just to consider a different way of being. And it was very exciting. They were really wanting to work with me. What I then encountered was local ward councillors terrified that they were going to lose their votes. And what became really apparent is that votes became more important than the actual change and what people had actually even put in their own manifesto. So the Liberal Democrats, in this case, declared, you know, a whole load of things that they were going to do. When it came to the reality, they were anxious at local level of that change. So it's really important for people to understand the process. So a local councillor, and anybody can approach their local councillor, can work towards putting a traffic regulation order in, a TRO. And that TRO at a local level has a lot of change. You can call for parking to be removed, all kinds of things. So if you get elected as a Green councillor, you can enact change through a TRO in your ward. Now, there will be a person above you in the cabinet level that will probably try and oversee you. And I had direct experience, particularly in Bath. We have the very famous circus. And when I looked at the TRO as I literally got elected, and the TRO had said to remove all the parking on the inner circle of the famous historic circus. The ward councillors had decided they didn't want it. And I thought, well, it's in the process. It's been through the process. I'm going to sign it off because I thought that was the right thing to do. And I did. And I had a lot of pushback. And it taught me very quickly, very early on, that people don't want to lose road spaces, and they don't want to lose car parking, and they don't want to change the space of cars. And going back to what Tony and David has said about carbon emissions, the surface transport is the biggest emitter of carbon in this country. We need a seismic change. We can't do this incrementally in a little bit. We have to make really radical change very, very quickly. And unless we do that, I don't want to use swear words, but I can imagine what you all think I'm about to say. So we we need to overcome that. So my call to arms is actually get elected, get into power as quickly as possible. And the more Greens that we can have on local councils, the more change that we can really deliver across the board on transport, because it is one of the key sectors where local councillors have real power.
That's fantastic, Joanna. Thank you. And I realise I didn't introduce myself at the very beginning. So just to introduce myself, I'm an Islington councillor and a London Assembly member, which means I'm elected to check the Mayor of London is doing a good job. And I'm also transport spokesperson for the National Party. But I have a low traffic neighbourhood being installed in my ward locally, and it's really interesting. There's a lot of noise against low traffic neighbourhoods, lots of noise on Twitter and on Nextdoor and those kind of social platforms. But actually, when you speak to people about what's going on, the number of people who are grumpy is a small and organised group, whereas the vast majority of people just are so grateful to have less through traffic going through the area and have more places where it feels safe and possible to walk and cycle. And that applies both to older people, people getting their children to school, and also to disabled people, because if you're walking with a white cane or if you're using a wheelchair, having streets where it's safer and easier to cross the road does make a difference. So people do get worried about losing, people get worried, elected people get worried about taking away car space, but actually the benefits are so clear when it happens that bit of inconvenience for people who are driving or for those driven journeys actually gets outweighed by all the other benefits. I'm going to come to Alan now with a question about how do you think the sort of individual people and communities affected by these changes will be affected by these changes, and do you think there are other benefits beyond reducing carbon emissions?
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's a number of things which will benefit people. Accessibility will be improved. What we need is more kind of local shops, local schools, local surgeries, because then everybody can access them rather than just those who've got access to a car if they have to drive several miles to a supermarket or something. So that's something which is beneficial to people. Then there's the individual's health with less air pollution from less car use. That means not just reduction in CO2 emissions, but also in particulates and indeed from the particles from tires. So everybody benefits from health, and that means it's actually much better for people who are cycling and walking, because they're not having to cycle and walk through polluted air. And it's estimated that 40,000 premature deaths per year are due to air pollution in this country. So that's a big effect. Walking and cycling obviously are good for the individual as well. They're good for our individual health. And even catching the bus or train usually involves some walking to a bus stop or a railway station. Safety will also be improved with fewer cars on the road are driving shorter distances. That means it's going to be safer for pedestrians and cyclists. And then you get to a kind of virtuous circle. Because it's safer, more people are willing to use cycling and walking. So that's another benefit. And then sort of finally, there's a community benefit, because when a street is choked with either parked cars or speeding cars, it's very difficult for neighbours to simply talk to each other. And it's been found that where you have less traffic, you get a better community, because neighbours are able to talk to each other. Children are able to play with each other, particularly if it's a pedestrianised street. The one I live in has been pedestrianised for many years, and children can freely go into their friends' houses a couple of doors away. The parents don't have to worry about traffic, because there isn't any. So there's community benefits. It helps to kind of build the community and reduce isolation. And of course, that then has benefits for mental health, because people feel they are part of a real community. They're not just isolated. So there's benefits kind of physically and mentally for reducing car use and improving facilities for walking and cycling. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, I'm seeing lots and lots of questions in the Q&A function, which is amazing. I believe you have I don't have that function because I'm on the panel, but I believe you have a function to be able to upvote questions. So do please use the upvoting so that we get the questions that most people want to be answered up to the top of the system. And we're just going to have a bit of a discussion about moving stuff. And sort of thinking about the carbon emissions from moving stuff. So David, how can we reduce the amount of stuff that we move, particularly internationally? And obviously this feels quite topical with the problems with heavy goods vehicle movements and whatever. David.
Yes, the media are giving us pre-publicity for this particular part of the session, aren't they? Where are we? Moving stuff. From a green point of view, the first thing we need to think about is moving to a circular economy, not taking stuff out of the ground, but reusing the stuff we've got. And reuse itself is a key part of that. To state the blindingly obvious, when you no longer find your house appropriate, you don't trash it, you sell it on to somebody else. The same with a vehicle. So we need to be thinking much more about how we get reuse out of all the things that are made. And that reduces the transport requirements, and of course it reduces the mining and extraction requirements. So far, so good. Secondly, we need to be thinking about more recycling. We all know what recycling is. Getting it as good as it needs to be requires changes in separation. It requires new recycling processes to be developed and put in place for all kinds of things. And it requires standardization, so that the labeling of plastics makes it clear which plastics are recyclable. We take out the ones that aren't recyclable, but it makes the separation and recycling processes more effective. So we need to do a lot in the circular economy space. Couple of other things. We should be doing no air freight, except for medical emergencies. I think one can say that with confidence. No air freight. Air freight is very much worse per ton carried than freight by sea. And we should be thinking hard about how we relocalize the economy. This has always been a green priority, and we should be thinking about that. Not everything can sensibly be relocalized, particularly agricultural goods, but nonetheless, it is a key part of how we are going to reduce the volumes. There's, again, a lot of other things, but those things I think are a good start.
Thank you very much. And Tony, can I get you to give us a bit of information about heavy goods vehicles? Most of them use diesel. They also use red diesel for their refrigeration, which has terrible air pollution consequences. What do you think we can do to reduce that? Is it about kind of getting freight off the roads and onto rail with an electrified rail, or is it about hydrogen, other fuels? What's going on?
Okay, Caroline, I'll give a go at answering this. what we do in the climate emergency policy working group and in the energy policy working group is to kind of look at all of these transportation problems and then try and link them in with other policies and other areas and see what is going to work. And until fairly recently, our policies were not that great in delivering what is the party's target of zero carbon by 2030. So what I'm going to say is our latest attempt in order to get HGV emissions right down by 2030. And it will take investment and it will take political will. But given all of those, this is the sort of proposal we're putting forward. So one thing is, in terms of HGVs, compared with how I looked at it 2 or 3 years ago, battery HGVs are coming forward. They will solve part of the problem. So you can find stuff about Mercedes or Tesla or DAF who produce it. And but probably this may only be 10% of the problem to being solved in this way. And it might be for more local routes as opposed to beating up and down the motorway system. Another one which has come up quite strongly recently and being promoted by the Centre for Sustainable Transport and the Climate Change Committee is pantographs on motorways. So having overhead electricity, it's got great advantage for the HGVs themselves, because they can operate on a much smaller battery, only needing to take them the sort of last 10 miles off the motorway system. And they've come up with some quite good costed schemes for this. And we think that we might be able to get phase 1 of their scheme working by 2030, and that might take another 10% of the HGVs off of our diesel and be powered on these pantographs on our motorway system. Another area which we're very keen, and we've touched on it in previous sessions, is the production having an oversupply of wind and renewables. And when we've got too much oversupply, over demand, we turn it into hydrogen. And as long as we've got can achieve that oversupply by 2030, then we would create hydrogen. And quite a lot of that would go to being used by HGVs. And it's got its difficulties in conversion of electricity into hydrogen, and there's losses. But we would be targeting about 40% of HGVs to be moved in this way. So that's in our current usage. There's still diesel. We don't think we'll get rid of all the diesels by 2030 at the moment, although we'd be very pleased to hear more ideas and convince us that we can. But there might be foreign HGVs. So there might be some niche cases which are going to be pretty difficult to sort out. And I won't go into all of the details of them, but we still have 20% of current diesels, but that's a great improvement on what we've got at the moment. We've looked at biodiesel for HGVs, and we've got some big problems with this. One of them is the complete lack of land, and our policies at the moment is only sustainable energy use from biofuels. And so we're really assuming next to zero from that. The other area of emissions, which we've sort of bunched in 20% or so, is doing less, as David's been talking about. So we're carrying less around. Although there's quite a few things in our Green New Deal where we'll have to transport more things around. So that's got to be thought of in the balance. There's rail freight. Rail freight runs about 10% of HGV freight at the moment. So the scope for improving it, but and we probably should do a bit more looking at this, but it doesn't always end up in the right place. So putting in new rail lines by 2030, many of them will probably be quite hard. Another bit that we've got into our calculations is speed limits. We have Green Party policy to have considerably lower speed limits. And this collectively over our HGVs may save like 6% of energy use. And this could still be useful. And so if that cuts down the remnant of energy, then that would be good. And there's some areas where we think there still needs to be more research and before we can really crack it fully. But I think it's much more promising now than it was 2 or 3 years ago.
Fantastic. Thank you. And that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about the link between our speed limit and the amount of emissions coming from heavy goods vehicles moving around, because obviously they're such big, heavy vehicles that that reduction in speed would actually make quite a difference. And if we're going to see escalating fuel costs, then there could also be incentives for businesses to slow down their speeds, which also obviously has all the benefits of reduced road danger and helping achieve our goal of Vision Zero of no one being killed on the road. I want to take us a little bit more into thinking about local deliveries, last mile deliveries. And John, if you'd like to start with this, you know, what about that last mile, the kind of the e-assist cargo bikes, shared deliveries, electric vans? Have you got any thoughts on how things can change there?
Yes, well, I think things can change massively, and there's a lot of experience around more in mainland Europe actually than in the UK on how we can deal with allegedly so-called last mile. You know, it basically involves quite a new approach to sustainable freight distribution and transport generally, and also linking to things which are still regarded as rather too radical, but I think increasingly essential. So, for example, car-free towns and cities. You know, we definitely need to move more in that direction. And interestingly, my colleagues in Germany are working very hard on car-free Berlin at the moment, and the mayor of Paris is working on car-free Paris. And York City Council in York, with a lot of Green Party involvement, are into car-free York. But basically, we can substitute get rid of a large number of so-called white vans for local deliveries. That's all the Amazon online shopping, everything like that, with e-cargo bikes. So this is quite well documented. There are some interesting projects around in London and in other UK cities with the cooperative supermarket group, basically implementing e-cargo bikes. That in itself is part of another big thing, which the language is a bit peculiar, freight consolidation centres. So basically you stop as many vehicles as you can entering an urban area. They then have to unload, and the freight is then reallocated to something recognisable as a Royal Mail kind of sorting office system. And that can go into e-cargo bikes to households or to retail outlets and so on. There's a lot of opposition in Britain to this, and there are costs associated with it. And those costs are argued about in terms of, would it be the retailer, would it be government, would it be industry, would it be transport policy, who would pay for it? Again, we're back to a fairly familiar strand, I think, in Green Party policy development. We've got a lot of really good tested ideas on how to get rid of a very large number of local deliveries in our urban areas, and to substitute a majority of those with e-cargo bikes. We can get rid of a lot of lorries as well with the what they call freight consolidation centres, and we know how to do that. What we don't have yet in Britain, which is very enormously helpful in Germany, is the taxation system. So in Germany, for example, they have my German is appalling, I keep trying to improve it, so do forgive me, Lastkraftwagenmaut. We have a heavy goods vehicle tax. Heavy goods vehicles are taxed according to the weight they're traveling and the distance they're traveling, and that produces a modal shift. It produces a shift from the lorries to rail, and there's money available for developing particular rail freight things. And the Germans are very good at particular kinds of rail freight things, where whole lorries go on the back of trains, for example. So it's a whole number of things. It's a bit like the Russian doll thing. You know, we need the taxation changes. We need to get rid of the 34 billion currently going into new road construction in England and start reallocating that to freight consolidation centres and e-cargo bikes and so on. In our South Shropshire project, and this is quite a small rural area, we're only 85,000 people in the Ludlow constituency. We've actually got a project which has now agreed to go ahead in Ludlow. to do e-cargo bikes. So that vans, this is not lorries really, this is vans, will have to disgorge their goodies at some point outside of Ludlow and stick them in the e-cargo bikes, and they'll be delivered to people's homes and retail outlets. And we're trying to reduce traffic levels for all sorts of reasons that we're all familiar with in Ludlow. So again, we know how to do it. We've got the expertise. We've got the technical backup. Britain falls over on who's going to fund it. We don't have a clear line on the funding responsibilities, so we've got to solve that one. But I think Green Party thinking is quite correct, heavily in favour of e-cargo bikes, heavily in favour of reducing heavy goods vehicles, heavily in favour of car-free towns and cities. And I want to link car-free towns and cities to the last mile thing and to a whole number of other things that we are trying to promote.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. Now, Joanna and Alan, do you have anything that you want to add on that kind of last mile delivery piece? Joanna?
Yeah, I would add to that too. I mean, thank you, John. That was brilliantly articulated. What we need to also think about is behaviour change of local people and what we move around. And why do we move that around? I mean, we've got very used during the pandemic to sitting at home and having things delivered to us, which is fantastic. But that has created this sort of huge number of extra vehicles on our local roads delivering things to us, and there's no sort of understanding of who's delivering it to who. I have a friend who's a technical wizard, and he said he was watching one day his object coming to him, and how it moved from a friend's house to somebody else's house, and it never got to him until about 2 hours later, whereas it could have easily been delivered at the same point. So there's very little technology in place to actually put in better systems for delivery. So on top of the taxation system, do we actually need to say, okay, you can only deliver, and I'm making this up, 100 vehicles in a town a day? And then would the 100 vehicles a day work in a much better systemic way that would deliver more efficiently to a lot of people? So I don't mean to say, you know, we've sold off the post office, but the action of that has created a huge group of other people moving around our cities and towns in a very different way to how they used to. And we also have to think about how we do things. So sometimes my car doesn't work. I do have a car, and if it doesn't work, there's an e-cargo bike in Bath and North East Somerset. I'll do a big shop at the supermarket. I'll ring him up. He'll come and meet me. I'll be on my bicycle. He'll put all my food into his e-cargo bike. He'll transport it home, and then he'll even bring it into the front door. He won't quite put it in the fridge, which is what I would like him to do. But what I would say is that, you know, there's a different way of thinking about things. And I think the problem also is lots of us don't know how to think differently. So how can we, as the Green Party, give people other imaginative ways of thinking about how they move things around? One of the projects I'm trying to do locally here is we have a huge number of local groups and businesses that move things around, but they don't know how they could move things around differently, so they get in their car. If you could just create something at a very local level and create that change, then I think it would lead to the wider ideas that John was putting in terms of consolidation and taxation, because people could actually see that delivered. And on top of that, going back to how everything fits together, we need better road spacing that is safe for cyclists of all kinds. And until we have that, that is also our problem.
Couldn't agree with you more on the safe space on our roads. We have a huge number of people being killed and very seriously injured at the moment in London, and it seems to have just been a really awful spate of very serious collisions, and actually, unless we make that space, you can see why people keep deciding to get in a car. Alan, was there anything you wanted to chip in on this?
Yes, just a couple of points. I mean, John's covered the consolidation hubs and cargo bikes and such like, but it occurs to me that a lot of the courier vans at the moment are diesel vans, and we want to reduce the number of those by consolidating, but also they already all ought to be electric vans. These short journeys with multiple stops are ideal for electric vehicles, so there needs to be more incentives to encourage the courier companies to convert to electric vans. And the other thing is, not everybody is at home all the time to receive these packages that are arriving. So what I think we need is collection points. It might be a local shop, a rail station, a post office, somewhere like that, that the packages can be dropped off and the recipient can go and pick them up later, to avoid the couriers having to go back multiple times, because that's again a waste of traffic. So it's all these kind of fairly small detailed things to make the sustainable transport modes work more efficiently.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's one wonderful example of local transport, that local courier delivery that I've seen recently, which is that the former car parking space for the Commissioner of Transport for London's car has been converted into a delivery hub, and electric for UPS or DPD or one of the delivery companies. And they bring the parcels in an electric lorry from East London. And then we went into the hub, and it had lots of little bicycles, electric bicycles with a kind of like little van on the back. And there were a load of workers who were kind of scanning the parcels. They all had QR codes on them, getting them into the right little electric van, bicycle powered, and they were all going off all over Westminster, being delivered either on foot or on these e-bikes. And it really did seem like this is taking away a sort of chauffeur driven car and replacing it with something that is actually much more useful for for local deliveries and for low carbon local deliveries. So, but Joanna's point about the post office having been sold off just as we need it. There's a local post office sorting office right around the corner from where I live, and it's been sold off and is going to be turned into housing, which we need lots of housing, but we also need sorting offices for parcels. And I think we're going to find a lot of urban areas are going to really regret having sold off that functionality of post office sorting places for managing these parcels. Now, I'm actually going to take us into the questions in the Q&A now, because there's 79 questions. I would suggest panelists, if you're not speaking, if you have a look at the questions and think if there's anything in there that you would particularly like to answer. But I'm going to pick up, just to start with, there was a question, and I hope I can find it now, about rural buses and the need for more rural buses and how can we make that happen. And I just wonder, John, do you have, I'm sorry, I can't find the exact question, but it was about, what can we do in rural areas to reduce people's reliance on, of feeling forced to use a car and buses. John, would you be able to pick up on that?
Yeah, this has been a big part of our work in Shropshire, and it applies generally. I mean, any place with the word Shire at the end, this is also relevant. I mean, I've been working CPRE. I've done a really excellent piece of work, costed, with a lot of detail in, which they call one bus every hour, every village. And the costs associated with that are actually quite trivial by comparison to, for example, the road building programme. And the way that this would be done does depend. We're back to my favorite Russian doll metaphor. So first of all, we have to scrap the privatization, deregulation. We have to stop the, whatever it is, £200 to £300 million a year that's siphoned off to shareholders of Arriva and Stagecoach. and we use that money to develop an integrated network where buses meet trains and buses are on an hourly schedule. The thing about it is it's not difficult to do. There's even a whole technology, which again, back to my clever German and Swiss colleagues, pulse timetabling. I won't even bore you all with pulse timetabling, but it basically means that even in relatively rural, sparsely populated rural areas, you can bring everything together for 5 minutes per hour, and the train stops and 6 buses arrive and then they all fan out again, and then it's silent for the other 55 minutes, if you like. So we know how to do it. We have the software, we have the algorithms, we know it doesn't cost very much. The one bus every village every hour thing is under 3 billion a year, that is, to run. We've got to get rid of the privatized bus companies, so we can do it. And the evidence around Europe especially is that if you do that, even in places, I mean, I've worked a lot in Germany and Sweden, and they really do love their cars. You know, we're not anti-car, but what there's a kind of a psychology and a behavioral pattern whereby it is regarded as just a bit dumb. It's just a bit stupid, you know, if you've got a high quality bus system and you've got segregated traffic-free cycleways and you've got Tempo-30, 30 kilometers per hour, 20 miles per hour on every street and road, and you've got adequate highway space reallocation, so there's more space for bikes and more space for people and less space for traffic, then people, they do it, you know, they actually still have a car, but they switch their travel choices away from the car to the alternatives. So this is all the reason why we really need the Green Party to have a lot more councillors and a lot more clout, because there's no shortage of data, there's no shortage of evidence, there's no shortage of logic, there's no shortage of money. There's just a shortage of brain cells in county halls, and we just need to sort of somehow get the right kind of virus, not the wrong virus, the right kind of virus to infect those brain cells in county hall, and we can do it.
Well, John, that's a very good call to action for everyone to go out helping their local target to win campaign to get more people elected to put in some green policies. Alan, have you chosen a question out of the list?
I just wanted to add something to the response to that one, which is another scheme which is being trialled here in Milton Keynes, where I live, which incidentally is more than half rural in terms of land area. So we have a big rural hinterland as well as the sort of city area. And that's demand responsive transport, where people can phone up. What we have is a network of I think it's 9-seater minibuses, many of which are electric ones. Mostly people access this through their mobile phone and say, I want to go from A to B, and the system looks up, sees which vehicle is nearest and allocates and says, right, you know, there will be a vehicle at a particular road junction or something like that. It doesn't come to your house, but it comes to fairly close, and then takes you and possibly others to where it is that you want to go. We've only had that for 6 months and it's not perfect yet, but it is being, you know, I think a good way of getting people where they want to go by a public transport system where there's not enough people wanting to go in the same direction to make a regular bus route viable. So, you know, I think that, you know, you've got to sort out algorithms and criteria of who can use it and when and such like. But, you know, I think that's a real way to go in terms of giving people access without them having to own their own car.
It sounds like we're going to need a bit of everything, actually, if we're going to get through this. Joanna, David, or Tony, have you chosen a question out of the chat? Okay, I'll go to Tony and then Joanna.
I've seen two which aren't quite at the top, which I can say something about. One is the ban of new fossil fuel cars happening early enough, and should we be pushing for an earlier date? And that's a fairly easy one, because about a year ago at Green Party conference, we passed a motion saying that there should be an earlier date. And the dates, I think, and David will put me right if I've remembered it wrong, is 2025 for banning new fossil fuel cars and vans, and 2030 for banning them on the road. So that's a kind of, I think that's summarising the party policy. So we are pushing for it to happen earlier. And then another question, which I can answer quickly, was about the Green Party's stance on the use of hydrogen. And I'll answer it a bit more widely, is we do have in the mix of energy that we're proposing, we do have a problem with storage of our energy. We had a light patch in September. Some things are going to have to use stored energy. And the surplus wind power, if we oversupply our wind power, we will have surplus electricity. And the best way of storing that is to put it into hydrogen and then to use that hydrogen for some purposes in our economy.
Thank you. Joanna, you've chosen a question.
So there were quite a few questions about rural movement and the cost of transport on trains, etc. So I sort of want to sort of pull those together in a way. I think we need to really identify the issue of rural to urban transport and how it is a problem. But is the way that we presently do things what we should do? And did we always do that? Which the answer is no. So do we need to think differently about what rural living might look like and how we live and move around? So I did a big piece of work in Bath and North East Somerset about children and how they went to school. And one of the things I identified was that particularly in Bath, we have a huge number of private school children. We have 4,000 private school children in Bath compared to the 10,000 state school. And they are coming from the rural areas predominantly into the city and being driven that way. So there's an equity situation here. And I think, in terms of cars and how we get into a car and we think, oh, it's cheaper to get into our car. What we don't recognize is that you are subsidized in your private vehicle on a regular basis. So it's a tune of about £600 per man, woman and child across every person in the whole of Europe to subsidize your movement in that vehicle that day. And we don't have that data in front of us. So we think, oh, it's cheaper. So our understanding of what cars are and what they mean to us needs to be shifted. And there needs to be a new language about what it means. And if you think about how the car industry makes a huge amount of money out of leasing and renting cars to people, if we all spent that money on public transport, we would have a very different system in place. So I think we need to think about what money is, where money is moved and what it does and who it does it for and who it makes a profit for, because that is the issue about why we don't solve the problems we have. As we've heard from this evening, there is a million ways we can solve our problems, but we want to organize our money in a present way that give people a profit of a certain kind. And that's our issue.
Yeah.
No, completely. And the business of selling cars is actually the business of selling car finance and loans. And it'll be very interesting to see what the current kind of combination of financial crises around energy and everything else that's going on at the moment. It'll be very interesting to see how that starts relating to finance for things like cars when people start having to pay very much higher interest rates than we've been used to for the last sort of 20 or more years. David, have you chosen something out of the chat?
Yes, I have. And it's one with a wider resonance, which is why I think it's useful to address it. Dave Marsden asks, is the focus on electrification the best policy rather than focusing on alternatives? And the answer to this question, as to quite a lot of questions, is it isn't one or the other. That almost certainly we need a mixture of electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles and cargo bikes and there is a need for a rational planning of the system so that each of these things finds its niche. And those niches won't be stable indefinitely. We are not building a perfect society from a blueprint. We are moving in the right direction, at least that's what we should be doing. And get the same thing on energy generation, that is a mixture of generating technologies, some more important than others. So I think there's a danger of looking for the panacea and saying, oh, well, if all we used was this, some people have tried to persuade me that hydrogen is the answer. Well, it's got a place, but it's got a place and so have other things. So we should avoid panacea thinking.
Great. Alan, have you chosen a question out of the Q&A list?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions really about off-road networks, public rights of way and such like in the countryside. And you know, I certainly agree that they ought to be enhanced. We've got the Sustrans National Cycle Network, I think it's called these days. But you know, varying states of sort of the actual surfaces there. Some are much better than others. But on the other hand, we have the £27 billion road investment strategy, RIS2 as it's known, for building lots of new dual carriageways and motorways and so on. And I think a lot of that money, instead of building these motorways and dual carriageways, ought to be invested in these cycleways, off-road networks and so on, because that would also link the villages to the nearest towns, as well as producing sort of long distance routes for leisure purposes, for walking and cycling. And just on a slightly different thing, again, that money that's allocated by the government for the RIS2 for the roads, a lot of that I think ought to go on to electrification of the railways, because we need a lot more electrified railways, and particularly connecting up to freight warehouses, depots, ports and so on, where, because at the moment a lot of the freight that is on the rail, which is a very good thing, is diesel hauled, but the government says they can't afford to electrify the railway lines, yet they're willing to spend the billions on the roads. So spend those billions on the footpaths, cycleways and so on, and electrification of the railways.
Thank you. John, have you chosen something out of the Q&A? If not, I think I may have something for you, but if you've chosen one, go for it.
Yeah, I'm happy to substitute something better, but I was interested, there were a couple of comments about free fare public transport, which is something I've spent quite a bit of time looking at, because there's a European project on free fare public transport, and we have about 100 live schemes underway. So the 100 exist at the moment, where public transport is totally free, full free fare public transport. And I'm looking at it from the point of view of how it might contribute to decarbonisation. There isn't time to discuss it properly now, of course, but I'm happy to continue in some other way. There are reasons for not doing it, I understand that, but also it's an example of how people do willingly change their behaviour if they think they're getting something for nothing, or they think they're getting something cheaper. You know, we can, on the one hand, we can have congestion charging, so we're going to hit you very hard with a financial penalty if you do something we don't want you to do. And then if you're up to the opposite end of that, we can say we're going to give you something incredibly valuable if you actually would consider changing your behaviour. And I think we need to do a lot more behavioural rethinking about this. There is a willingness to change behaviour. Our public transport fares, rail and bus, are outrageous, in Shropshire particularly, outrageously high. People do often make, I mean, it doesn't matter, they might be wrong. They often do make calculations along the lines, yeah, I can take 3 people in my car, 25 miles, and it costs me 10 pence. And if I go by bus and train, it will cost me £10. You know, people make all sorts of comparisons of that kind. Full free fare public transport needs a lot more looking at, and I think it should be part of a huge behavioural shift in the population at large, and linked to better services. There's no point shifting people to full free fare public transport if there's no buses, you know, that kind of thing. And I was interested that a couple of people did mention that, and people might not be aware that it is being heavily researched at the moment. And if people want to hear more, I can send them stuff, because I've written about it as well, and how it might work and how it would work and who'd pay for it, how much would it cost. And it does involve, by the way, getting rid of the shareholders in Arriva and Stagecoach and such things. So that might make it popular or unpopular, depending on your point of view.
Excellent, excellent. Now, one of the things, there's a question about micro road charging, and I know, John, you did a report on road charging for Darren Johnson when he was a London Assembly member, which is when I first learnt about it. But I think the need for some kind of way of getting people who are driving to chip into the cost of fixing potholes, because with low emission cars, the vehicle emissions duty that's coming into government is going right down. And this is another way that that people driving cars are being massively subsidized these days, because people are paying less and less into the overall sort of pot of money that keeps things going. And I just wondered if anyone wanted to say anything about the need for sort of smart, fair, and obviously privacy friendly road charging by mile and by engine emissions, and possibly by time of day, and by the availability of public transport or not. You don't pay very much if there isn't any public transport. I don't know, John, do you have anything to add on that one?
You're quite right, Caroline. I mean, at the moment, there's a great deal of interest in and it has various kind of techie phrases attached to it, but it's dynamic road pricing, basically based upon fairly, non-punitive empirical data about the costs that a drive a car journey on a certain kind of road at a certain time of day, in a certain level of congestion, in areas where there might be quite adequate public transport and so on. And again, the technology, the algorithms, the software, the GPS, the smartphones, everything exists to make this possible. And to me, I see this as a no-brainer, linked to a fairly transparent and validated data set. I don't want drivers to feel that they're just being punished. I think most people would agree, and we should ask them, that it's quite reasonable to pay the cost that your choices are imposing on all of us. And do that in a very fair and transparent way, and that is part of a big shift that we should all be getting involved in. Big modal shift, changing where we travel to and how we travel to places. And I can't really see an argument against this, but it's another one of these interesting things that's probably overly researched, massively overly researched. I have been told that the Treasury quite like the idea because they're bricking it because of the lack of petrol tax or something along those lines. So, interestingly, the people that we might not normally be friendly with are actually saying the same kind of things. So we should just do it.
Yes. Joanna, you've just had your hand up to come in.
Yeah, I would add to that. There's a social justice issue here. There's been a lot of studies to show that, the wealthiest people move around the most. Anyway, so we're not charging people who are the poorest in this. It is the wealthiest who move around the most and can afford to. So I really support what John is saying.
Fantastic. I'm going to, we're beginning to run out of time, and I want to give each of the panelists a chance to highlight one policy, and you're going to have to do it in a word or maybe 3 words maximum, that the Green Party should be highlighting ahead of COP in Glasgow. So who's going to go first? Very good, Tony.
Well, I was going to go first because I think it's international aviation and shipping, because the COP26, it's all about the international things, and the Paris Agreement has really not addressed this properly.
Excellent. David?
Every country, every party to the treaties should be required to set a date by which they will stop selling fossil-fueled cars and another date by which they will forbid the use of fossil-fueled cars on their roads. For the developed countries, it should be an early date, 2025. For the poor countries, the less developed countries, maybe 2030.
Okay, I'll let you off having gone over on your words. Alan, have you got one thing, but brief?
Rail electrification. This country is way behind our European partners in terms of the proportion that is of our rail network that's electrified. It's something that there's no technological problems. We know how to do it. It's just a case of getting the Treasury to allocate the money.
Okay, rail electrification, good one. Joanna, you're on mute.
We need to move away from the individual model of car ownership and the reduction in the car size of the car fleet. So we have to, that is our biggest problem in this country in terms of surface transport. If we don't solve that problem, we have we are up to the water and up to the necks in water. So, the only way forward is actually sharing cars. That's what we have to do. E-sharing should be compulsory.
Excellent. So cutting down on car ownership. John, one thing.
Yeah, every town and city in the United Kingdom should be totally car-free in a well-defined central area.
Beautiful and very succinct as well. So thank you, all of you. I'm afraid we are going to have to start wrapping up here. And I want to thank everyone who's contributed really interesting questions. And I'm sorry we haven't been able to tackle all of them, but I hope we've tackled a lot of them. So yes, everyone who's contributed very interesting questions, and in particular, I want to thank all our panelists for their thoughtful answers. This is the last event of this series for 2021, so we'd also like to give a big thank you to David, Tony, and also to Phil Horton, who's not on the panel today, for showing up every week to share their knowledge, as well as to all the other guests who've contributed along the series. The video replays for this event series are all on the Green Party's climate emergency policy, are all in the Green Living Room, which is available via the Green Party website. And the Green Party staff team will share a roundup post in the weekly sort of Greens Connect email that's going to be coming up this week, which I think will have links to everything. Now, if you want to sign up to join in the work of the climate emergency or the Transport Policy Working Group, there are email addresses being put in the chat, I think at the moment, for the two conveners. So Transport is Alan Francis. Alan, yes, you've seen Alan, and Climate Emergency is David Flint. Now, there is a fringe conference on the Saturday from 5:30 to 7 o'clock that you might be interested in if you were interested in this session, which is called Getting Transport to Zero Carbon, Where Policy Meets Practice. So look out for that, 5:30 to 7 o'clock on the Saturday of conference. And finally, if you're not a member, but you've enjoyed this session, do please sign up. I think Holly is going to be inserting a link in the chat. And if joining is a step too far for you just at the moment, you can always become a friend of the Green Party. And there's also a link for becoming a friend being put into the chat. And I think there was a link earlier put into the chat for the South Shropshire climate action paper that John Whiteleg was talking about earlier. But if that could possibly be popped back in the chat again as well, that would be super helpful. And so that's it. Thank you very much, everyone. There is always so much more we can talk about on transport. It was transport that made me join the Green Party, and you know, there is so much we can do to make sure that people can get around safely under their own steam, breathing clean air, and without wrecking all our futures by traveling in a way that is that uses more emissions than makes any sense. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. And I think we're going off air now.
Thank you.